I kept asking myself throughout this thing, where's the sense of wonder and adventure that you should be getting from something like this? Time will tell whether opinions of this movie gradually shift over time and the Nolan bubble bursts. We have left perhaps the era of woke and we're entering the era of slop, where it's not politically motivated anymore, it's not trying to forward some social cause, but it's still crap movie making. The thing about gamers is that they are hyper invested in their hobby. Gamers are not shy about making their voices heard.
Can Star Wars be saved, do you think? Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked, and I'm delighted to be joined down the line by Will Jordan, better known as the Critical Drinker. Welcome, Will.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, there is obviously no topic more important to discuss in the world of film, in the world of media, the things that you talk about, than the Odyssey. Christopher Nolan's film is really the film that has launched 1,000 takes, I think you could say, even before anyone had seen it. There's huge amounts of controversy around the casting, around questions of historical accuracy. Well, now that you've seen it, I just wondered what is your honest initial reaction to the film, outside of those kinds of considerations? If you didn't know that there'd been this raging debate, what would you have made of the film?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to tackle that in my review and say, like, yep, there's casting controversies around this, but let's just take the film on its own merits and see how it is as a piece of entertainment. And honestly, my overall takeaway was that I was kind of bored by this one. I was really surprised by it. It feels like a checklist of things from the Odyssey itself that have to be gotten through. You know, the sirens, the woman who turns Odysseus's men into pigs, like all these things that never get any sort of context to them. They're just one thing onto the next thing and the next thing. And the big problem with the movie is just the lack of emotional engagement. Again, that was a real surprise. Considering the source material, I was never that invested in Odysseus and his quest to get home because I never sensed that he was that invested in it either. There's always this weird emotional disconnect with these characters. They're all very reserved. They're all very cold and distant and just emotionally sterile. And I think that's a bit of a problem with Christopher Nolan movies, and it seems to be getting worse. You've probably seen Oppenheimer, I would imagine. The romantic subplot between Cillian Murphy's character and Florence Pugh was one of the strangest, most sterile things I've ever seen on screen. It was like two androids trying to replicate human behavior, and I think he's got a real problem when it comes to that sort of thing. It was less of an issue in some of his previous movies, but in the Odyssey, it is a real problem. It's a real issue with this film. And yeah, it feels like a movie that wants to keep the viewer at a distance, and that's not what you should be getting with something like this.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's an incredible technical marvel, and maybe I enjoyed it a bit more than you did, but I think those shortcomings are really there. Chris Nolan can't do romance very well. He also, the Matt Damon Odysseus feels very guilty. There's a guilty conscience. That reminded me instantly of Oppenheimer. So maybe Nolan can get a free pass on that if that's that's the style of character that he likes and enjoys exploring. But I wondered, does it say something a bit more general, I think, about the state of Hollywood? I mean, they seem incapable of doing heroism or doing an exciting adventure, because that's something that the Odyssey is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be entirely bleak and washed out and that kind of thing. You know, it's supposed to be adventurous. It's supposed to be exciting. We're supposed to cheer for our hero. Yeah,
I mean, I kept asking myself throughout this thing, where's the sense of wonder and adventure that you should be getting from something like this? Because as you say, it's a epic adventure populated with larger than life characters, and Odysseus from the actual Odyssey is not this dour, depressed, traumatized war veteran. You know, he is a smart, often very witty, adventurous man who's willing to take risks. He's quite arrogant at times, often to his cost. And none of that was really reflected in this. And again, I think maybe there's this perception in Hollywood that any kind of traditional heroism is just old and stale and played out now, and it always has to have a different angle. It has to be subverted somehow. We have to explore it from different facets, and you see it in its most extreme form in a lot of these, franchise movies that have been continued in the modern day, whether it's Star Wars or Indiana Jones or whatnot. Not just a different perspective on heroism, but our active attempt to deconstruct it and say to the audience, these heroes that you used to cheer for, they were never really heroes in the first place. And that is just really, it's sinister and it's depressing, and it does not resonate with audiences. They have tried it again and again, and I think it's become clear at this point that it doesn't work. You're seeing a modified version of it in the Odyssey, for sure. Time will tell whether it ultimately gets away with it, or whether opinions of this movie gradually shift over time, and the Nolan bubble bursts.
Yeah, I mean, is that at worst our heroes are actually villains, or at best they have PTSD and are mentally traumatized by their heroic deeds.
Yeah, and you get
way.
the flip side of that as well, this active attempt to redefine villains as misunderstood heroes as well, where you lose any kind of moral center to your story and everything just becomes shades of grey, which can be done in some circumstances. Like, it's always good to have a morally complex villain who's at least got an understandable motivation. That's basic writing. But when there's an active attempt to reframe them as actually, maybe they're the good guys or whatever, that's where, again, you start to lose people. I mean, you see it in things like Amazon's Rings of Power, where the orcs, literally one of the most evil things ever created, are now portrayed as loving families who just want to protect their wife and kids and find a home for themselves. I'm sorry, man, you just can't do that anymore. There's limits to how far you can push this stuff.
Absolutely. And let's talk about the real hot button issue in the Odyssey, the casting. In particular, the casting of Elliot Page, formerly Ellen Page, transgender man in a male role, and Lupita Nyong'o as Helen of Troy, a kind of race swapping casting decision. What have you made of that? I mean, first of all, do you think that Nolan pulled it off? Did he get away with it? My sense was that he did, and I wasn't drawn out of the film because of it. But also, what do you make of the trend more generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think in this specific case of the Odyssey, he probably got away with it just by drastically limiting their screen time. Both of them are on screen for maybe a couple of minutes each. They're barely part of the story, so I think probably that helped him in this case. It did generate quite a bit of backlash online, which, say what you want about it in terms of motivations, but it does create a negative, contentious atmosphere around the movie that didn't need to exist. If it wasn't for that, I think everyone would be cheering it on, because Christopher Nolan is generally a popular filmmaker. He had a real home run with Oppenheimer, so it was like wading into a culture war that he didn't really need to be drawn into. So there is that. I think in a wider sense, the stuff with Elliot Page, I don't necessarily have an issue with. If the actor can play the role convincingly, then fine. Like, I would argue Elliot Page's ability to play a Greek soldier who's meant to be powerful and dangerous is pretty limited when they're like 5'1" and weigh about 90 pounds. The scene where they have to run across the beach in full armor, Elliot Page was struggling with that one, just with the sheer bulk of what they had to carry. But as with, race swapping characters like in Lupita Nyong'o's case, I think there is a growing sense that we're getting a bit tired of this stuff. We're seeing it more and more with things like that Vikings TV show, where suddenly you have a Norse medieval culture that's being led by a black woman somehow, and there's no explanation for how she came to be there. That's clearly absurd. You had that Channel 4 film where you had Anne Boleyn played by a black actress. Again, just blatantly trying to pretend like this historical figure who we know what they looked like was somehow black. Not every person can play every role, and as I pointed out in previous videos, that particular door only swings one way nowadays. It certainly happened in the past, in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Hollywood would whitewash characters. I don't approve of that in the slightest either, but that was a very different era, and it's over now. But we're now doing the opposite. And so, I think there's a growing disenchantment with that kind of thing. particularly, as I say, when nowadays it only ever goes in one particular direction. You wouldn't get any attempt to redefine, say, African culture or Japanese or Middle Eastern culture as having just a bunch of white people in it with no explanation. So why does the reverse seem to keep happening nowadays?
Yeah, and in general, it'd be good to talk about where Hollywood has gone wrong. I mean, one thing that you often talk about in your videos is the myth of the quote unquote modern audience. I mean, can you explain what that is and why that drives so many films to be, well, just terrible slop?
Yep. I think it's the idea that Hollywood has this imaginary concept that there's a huge untapped audience out there of extremely progressive, hardcore, left-wing young people out there who are desperate for entertainment that just, appeals to all of those sensibilities, everything that comes with it. And so they've made film after film, and they've adapted and retooled older films and older franchises to try to pivot towards this audience that they're convinced is out there if they can just reach them. And that's really the main explanation for the destruction of these big pop culture franchises. Why things like Star Wars went down the tubes. Why it suddenly got like swamped with girl bosses who were just amazing at everything, and it all became about gender politics and stuff. Why things like Marvel suddenly had the same thing happen to it. And the reality is their core audience has never changed. If you're talking about things like science fiction, fantasy, that sort of thing, it's predominantly men who are going to be watching it. It always has been, and it always will be. It doesn't mean that women can't watch it as well, but it's generally men. And the moment you start berating them or, minimizing them, or certainly in the case of a lot of movies now, having an active backlash against them the moment they criticize anything about it and create this weird contentious environment, you lose them as your audience, and you don't replace them with anything else, because fundamentally they are your core audience, and you lead to box office flop after box office flop and underperformers. And that's what we've been seeing. They've been courting a modern audience that doesn't exist and is never going to buy their product anyway, and they've lost their existing audience in the process.
And one thing that I find so infuriating about a lot of the kind of, whether it's diversity casting or the kind of girl boss trope, is that the characters in the end are very thin. They're very, inhuman in a way. That there are so many rich stories and characters that could exist, that could, could be diverse, could have interesting female leads. Mm-hmm. But they never are. They're always a sort of very thin caricature of what is expected to be in these films.
It's because they can't allow them to go on the hero's journey anymore. Like generally with your protagonist, they start out in one particular place in life, like they want to aspire to something, or they're given some adventure to go on. They encounter many obstacles and journeys along the way. They make mistakes. They have the downward arc where they doubt themselves. They eventually learn some kind of lesson about themselves that allows them to rise up and then triumph over whatever adversary they're up against. It's the classic hero's journey, success, failure, fall, rise again, easy. The problem is they're never willing to do that, because it means exposing them to a bit of vulnerability and a little bit of the acknowledgement that they're not perfect initially. They have to learn things and they have to improve themselves. And for some reason, they just seem to be allergic to doing that with any kind of female or diverse characters. The message instead becomes, you are perfect the way you are, and it's actually the rest of the world that just needs to acknowledge your greatness. And it's almost like the external world is the one that goes on the character arc instead of the protagonist. And the result then is, well, if your protagonist is never put through any trials and they never learn anything and they don't have any vulnerability or humanity to them, what on earth is the audience supposed to latch onto? There's nothing there. And as you say, you end up with a very thin, vapid, uninteresting character that's meant to be driving your story. It's a lesson I've tried to address many times throughout my videos. I've tried to explain why it doesn't work, but they keep doing it, man. It's impressive how stupid they are.
Do you think, will they ever stop? I mean, it does seem as if these you know, a lot of Hollywood films are not making money. A lot of the biggest franchises, as you said, people are turning their backs on them. You know, many films that you'd expect several years ago to be a guaranteed hit are completely flopping. Is Hollywood getting the message at all? Or are they taking the wrong message as well, alternatively? Because it does seem as if a lot of these films are still being churned out.
They are still churning them out. I mean, the most recent example probably was Supergirl, which flopped disastrously. Again, not understanding their audience and perhaps not even understanding the character they were working with. But in a broader sense, I think we've passed the peak of this stuff. I think the worst of it was probably, 3 or 4 years ago when it was just absurd. And they needed to, have that decent stretch of failures in order to start to turn things around. But Hollywood moves slowly. Studios move slowly because, from start to finish, a movie can take 4 or 5 years. And so you're still seeing the dregs of that era coming out now. But I think, for the most part, they have kind of passed the peak of it, and they're starting to pivot back to more general storytelling. It doesn't mean we're going to get great movies now. I think I've heard a lot of people say we have left perhaps the era of woke and we're entering the era of slop, where it's not politically motivated anymore. It's not trying to forward some social cause, but it's still crap movie making because you've lost a lot of that pool of talent that you diversity hired out of these roles. Like the writers' rooms are completely different now from what they were 10, 15 years ago. And you can't necessarily build that back in a hurry. A lot of these people will have moved on to other industries and they can't be replaced necessarily. So they've created quite the problem for themselves, and it's going to take a lot of humility and a lot of time and probably a lot of money to put it right. But I've got no sympathy for them because they entirely inflicted it on themselves.
Absolutely. And would you say, is there a particular film or a particular series that best embodies these kinds of trends? What's like the worst example of all this?
Oh gosh,
in your view? I mean, that's a tough question,
quite
I guess. There's
the
so
field
many
to
bad
pick
examples.
from. I think it might be the Acolyte from Star Wars. It was a TV show that they made a couple of years ago, and it was insane. It embodied everything. It's the two leads are a pair of black lesbians who are twins, played by the same actress, obviously. It centers around a coven of lesbian space witches who are also communist, I think, because they share everything. These two women are actually birthed by two other women through the power of the Force or something. The Jedi, which you remember from Star Wars, are generally portrayed as these wise warrior monks, very, very, very much the guardians of peace and justice. They're portrayed as corrupt and a negative influence on this idyllic coven. Essentially, and all the men, obviously, in it are useless, incompetent morons who apologize for existing and then just kind of die. So I think that pretty much embodies everything about the message that I talked about before. It tries to be all of that. It was really that taken to its ultimate conclusion. And it was such a calamitous disaster that Disney themselves had to step in and say, don't worry, we're never making another series of that. We're really sorry.
Can Star Wars be saved, do you think? Is it now irredeemable?
I suppose anything is technically fixable if you're willing to throw enough time and energy and money at it. I think it would probably take a new trilogy of movies, and they would have to all be really good to start to win people back. And it would mean probably taking an upfront loss. So say they brought out a new Star Wars trilogy and it was hyped up as the biggest thing ever. That first movie is probably going to lose money. That would just be the reality, even if it's good, because the fan base isn't there anymore. People have moved away from it and there's no trust anymore. The second movie, people would start to get interested. Maybe there's something to this. It might barely turn a profit. And then the third one would probably be where people are won back, and that would generate the hype, the profit, and that would probably get the franchise back on track. Whether they're willing to eat that kind of cost and whether they even have the ability to create some great new Star Wars trilogy at this point is really debatable, because again, the pool of talent that they have there is not what it was when George Lucas was in charge.
And I want to ask about James Bond because he's back in the news. The new director has been assigned, Denis Villeneuve, who's a brilliant director, is in charge of the Fantastic Dune franchise, among other things. But it's also now being handled by Amazon, and Amazon don't have the greatest track record. I mean, you mentioned Rings of Power earlier, which is one of their biggest disasters. So are you apprehensive, or are you confident about where James Bond could go? What's your feeling at this moment?
I'm absolutely apprehensive about it, yeah. A lot of it's going to come down to who they cast as Bond, because they still haven't decided. And we are several years removed from No Time to Die. So you're going to have a real gap there, which means a real loss of momentum for the franchise. The franchise has written itself into a corner as well, because they straight up killed Bond off at the last movie. So now they have to answer that age-old question of like all these different recastings of Bond. Is it the same character, or is it just different people taking on the James Bond code name? Well, now we have a definitive answer. So there's none of that character loyalty that you had for generations, whether it was Connery, Moore, Lazenby, Brosnan. They were all loosely tied into the same chronology. Now we're just going somewhere completely different, and it's contentious now. I don't know if Villeneuve would be my choice for a Bond director. As you say, he's definitely handled the Dune movies really well. He does that kind of epic storytelling, but he's not exactly a fast-paced, action-oriented director, right? Which is what you need for Bond. Very slow, ponderous movies with about 2 hours of establishing shots. I don't know if his style is going to gel very well with James Bond. So there is that, and yeah, I'm honestly just waiting for it to be a race swap or a gender swap for the next Bond actor. I know they desperately want to do it, and I know they're trying to figure out a way that they can justify it. So we'll see what happens.
And do you think people are tiring of franchises in general? I sort of wonder whether, even if, say, Marvel and DC, even if they hadn't gone a bit woke, would people not just be looking for new, interesting stories, stories that have, it's hard to think of the last, original film. I mean, even the film we've been talking about at the start is based on a 3,000-year-old epic.
Yeah. I mean, there's certain franchises that stood the test of time up until recently anyway. I mean, look at something like Star Trek. It began way back in the 1960s, and it was going relatively strong until the 2000s. It eventually sputtered out with that. They brought it back with the J.J. Abrams movies, which were, they made money, but they were pretty weak films. And then it's been bulldozed into the ground in recent years with terrible TV shows. I think what happens is oversaturation rather than franchises that have been running for too long. So the same thing with Marvel. Not only was there a decline in the quality of their product, but there was so much of it as well. You had TV shows multiple times a year. You had movies multiple times a year. It became like homework rather than a big event. So it was just too much too quickly. So there's certain franchises that I think can stand the test of time as long as they're measured and what you produce is done, to the highest standard possible. But I think because of all of that gradual erosion of all these once popular franchises, people now are desperate for new stories and original stories. And you see it now with the crazy success of things like Obsession, a little independent movie that was done on a budget of like $750,000 and has made like $400 million at the global box office. Just take a neat idea, get some good actors involved, and people will still show up for it. So it can still be done. Ideally, I want to see a bit of a reversion to that lower budget of filmmaking or mid-budget movies. So yeah, you can still do like a decent action, adventure, sci-fi movie for well under 100 million. You just need to be careful with how you use your resources. But then it means you can take risks creatively on things because there's not so much money at stake. When you're spending $200, $300, $400 million, you end up playing it safe and just making the same formulaic movie over and over again, like Marvel have done. And people get bored of that for sure.
And I was going to ask you about Obsession, actually, and Backrooms, the other example of a kind of, relatively low budget indie hit taking the world by storm. I mean, do you think, perhaps we need to look outside of Hollywood, outside of the main studios for exciting things these days.
I think so. And yeah, as I said, when you've got these low budget movies, they're willing to take chances with creative risks and something that's a bit outside the norm. And usually horror is a great genre for that because it's more a genre about ideas than spectacle. And so it's easy to do on a budget. And yeah, I think Hollywood being what they are, they'll probably learn all the wrong lessons from this. They looked at the success of Backrooms, and now apparently they're trolling Reddit for other internet creepypastas that they can turn into movies. Yeah, sure, I would definitely go to Reddit for all my great creative ideas. So, yeah.
Should explain to viewers that don't know that this is so the film was inspired by a post on 4chan of a similar kind of, I guess, the back room really of a sort of strip mall store. But yeah, I mean, it is taking the wrong lesson, isn't it, to think that you're just gonna, maybe they'll turn some tweets into a film or whatever, that.
I wouldn't put it past them, honestly.
I mean, yeah, horror is definitely having a revival. One genre that seems to have completely disappeared, especially in certainly in the cinema, is comedy. I mean, obviously, it seems to me that is a direct result of the kind of culture war that we've been talking about, the unwillingness to cause offense. But, could there be perhaps, now that we're undergoing a sort of vibe shift, now that people are tiring of political correctness, might we see a hit comedy? Once again, I can't remember the last hit comedy I saw in the cinema.
I think they're starting to dip their toes back into doing this again. I mean, we had the Naked Gun movie last year with I was going to say Liam Neeson, which is okay. It had its moments. They've got another scary movie that they brought out. They're bringing out Spaceballs 2. Again, a lot of these like old franchises that they're pivoting back to for the comfort blanket of knowing that it was once successful. So they're going to try that again. But yeah, great to see original comedies coming out again, original ideas. I think people like myself and a few others, we often point to things like Tropic Thunder as being the last original comedy idea that was mainstream and successful. But you're talking like late 2000s there. It's been a long time. And as you say, like to do comedy, you have to risk offending people. It's just the nature of comedy. It's about laughing at people, situations. And we're so averse to that as a culture, and Hollywood in particular is so averse to that it means taking a bit of a risk there. But I think as a culture, we're starting to get hungry for that again, because things about modern life are so absurd that all you can do is laugh at it. So why not?
The world is a lot funnier than it was 10 years ago.
It's hard to parody now,
Yeah, exactly. I want to talk a bit about gaming. You've got a gaming channel, The Critical Gamer. It's really, really great. People should check out. Gaming has always fascinated me because it's something, as an industry, it's 10 times bigger than Hollywood. I mean, if not even more. The amount of money that is spent on gaming, not just by consumers, but on developing video games now is easily rivaling Hollywood or surpassing it. And yet it doesn't quite have the cultural cachet. So we tend to leave it out of these kinds of discussions. But I mean, gaming, it's fair to say the backlash against a lot of this stuff came a lot earlier. I mean, I don't want to relitigate the whole Gamergate saga, but surely that was a sign that perhaps gaming fans were a bit earlier to say, up with this, we shall not put.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about gamers is that they are hyper invested in their hobby and their favorite franchises and so on, where on the movie side of things, it's a lot more just general audiences like normies who aren't necessarily that observant about the changes that can take place. But yeah, gamers are not shy about making their voices heard. And yeah, I think that whole Gamergate thing was a very early, backlash against the creep of all of this identity politics stuff into their hobby. And yeah, largely we're still feeling the effects of it today. Like some of the people who are involved in that are still active in the industry. So it was a crazy thing. But yeah, the gamers, I think, have generally resisted a lot of that stuff and probably will continue to do so because they are a very vociferous audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder if you could give some examples for non-gamers of where you've seen kind of woke culture creep into gaming. I mean, the one I've seen a clip a million times of is it Dragon Age, where you have a transgender dragon, a non-binary dragon. I mean, I'm sure there's millions of other worse examples, but
Yeah.
that come to mind.
So one of the big backlashes was against the Last of Us franchise. So for people who don't know, it's like a sort of survival story-based game where in the first game you play a man living in a post-apocalyptic world that's been overrun by these horrifying like zombies. Most of the world's population is now infected with this, and you have to escort a young girl who's got a resistance to this virus that could potentially be the key to curing it and saving the human race. And you have to form this sort of paternal relationship with her. It's all very well done, very well handled game. Then they did a sequel where the male lead is killed off within the first hour in the most brutal, pathetic way imaginable by a big muscle-bound woman, naturally, and then you take over as the female lead, who was the young girl from the previous game. Now she's a lesbian, of course she is, and she's had a complete personality shift where she's now just an obnoxious, arrogant asshole, and they recontextualize his actions from the previous game to basically turn him into a selfish villain. Even though he made some really difficult choices, did the best thing he could in the circumstances, now he's a villain. I think that was probably one of the worst examples, and the backlash against that game was enormous.
Yeah. And I mean, thinking of The Last of Us, I mean, it's been made into an HBO series, great series until I think the end, until it tries to adapt the part 2 of the franchise. But do you think that we are seeing a lot more video game Hollywood crossovers? Do you think that games are going to be mined for their characters, their stories? Because there have been some, I mean, Last of Us probably the best example. There have been some great stories told on that medium that a lot of people won't have had access to.
Yeah, absolutely, because I think we're coming to the end of the superhero era in cinema. I mean, it's really dominated cinema for the past 20 years. When we look at it, a lot of big summer blockbusters, it became a money printing machine for a long time. But I think it's run its course now, and generally people are just burned out with it. And I think Hollywood, being the creative wasteland that it is, they're going to look for something else that they can, as you say, strip mine for ideas and pre-established fan bases that they can then exploit for name recognition. And gaming is the next logical choice. As you pointed out, it's a huge industry, absolutely dwarfs Hollywood in terms of the money that could be made from it. And it's got very engaged fans who will be interested in, a movie or a TV show adaptation of their favorite games. So it's the new frontier. It's the new Wild West of Hollywood movie making. And they have been doing it more and more in recent years. You've seen things like the Mario movies, debatable what the quality of them is, but they make a lot of money. They've done the same with Sonic. They've made TV shows out of The Last of Us. They've got a Tomb Raider show coming. We've got a new Resident Evil movie coming in a few months from Zach Kreger. So there's more and more of this stuff, and it's going to keep happening. It's been proven now to make money, and they will strip mine it like they did with comic books.
And you've warned recently that there could be a gaming crash. What form do you think that'll take? And is that, I guess, similar to the way that Hollywood has been? Is gaming falling for similar reasons that Hollywood has?
Partly over here in the West, because I think the Eastern developers in Japan and so on and Korea are largely exempt from that kind of creep of identity politics because they just culturally do not endorse that stuff at all. So they're probably going to be the new replacements. But the problem is a lot of Western gaming studios are suffering from bloat. Their budgets have become insane. Some games are getting into the realms of $300, $400, even $500 million budgets. It's absurd. As much money as you can make from the industry, like that's insane that one game should cost that much to develop. And it's essentially at risk of sinking under its own weight. Because when you're spending that much money on one game and it flops, that could be your studio toast. Like you've lost all your resources on it. And so I think that's where it might be trending. Hopefully it doesn't happen. But as I say, if it does, it'll probably be the collapse of game development, AAA game development over here in the West, probably the Japanese and Korean studios will be exempt from it, and they will just move in and really replace them. They'll be by far the dominant force within the industry.
One of the problems with gaming now is this move away from physical media. In some ways it can be quite helpful to be able to download a game. You get updates with it. Sometimes you download a game and it's not finished. But also, given the certain cultural trends, I mean, woke may be on the way out, but could always make a resurgence. Should we be worried about the decline of physical media? Are our favorite franchises safe from future meddling? Could they be taken away from us even if we bought them? What's your take on that side of things?
You should absolutely be worried, yeah. The problem with digital media is that you don't really own anything, and you don't have a persistent copy of whatever it is that you've got. All you're doing is renting it effectively. You're entering into a license agreement with the company who maintains it, and they can revoke that if they choose, if they go under, if their licensing terms change. And you've seen it with companies like Sony recently, who had something like 500 movies available on the PlayStation Store that people will have bought and paid for, that they can just stream or download whenever they want, and they removed them. So it doesn't matter if you paid for it, you just can't watch it anymore. Bye-bye. So you've lost access to that. And there's the censorship issue where it's not all that difficult to edit out scenes or tweak scenes in movies from, say, previous decades that are now considered culturally insensitive, or, whatever you want to say, offensive to modern sensibilities. And they can just go in and change that. And you've got no recourse against it, because the only access you have to that movie is the file that they keep on their servers. And if they change that file, then your end product is going to change, regardless of whether you want it or not. And you see it in really stupid ways. Like, I don't know if you remember a few years ago, the movie Splash with Daryl Hannah. There's a scene in that where she's playing a mermaid, right? And there's a scene where she turns and runs away from the camera towards the ocean, and she's naked, so you can see her butt. But they decided that was too offensive, so they made her hair digitally longer to cover it. But it's just this really awkward looking square of hair that's like composited over her butt as she runs, and it looks absurd, but that's the kind of things that they can do. And if you've only got a digital copy of the movie, there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah. And final question, is there anything that you'd recommend across the media? What should people check out? What's worth seeing and not grumbling about?
Well, as we discussed there, I think Obsession is a really good movie. It's one of my favorite films of the year, so there's probably that. The Backrooms was a lot of fun. I'm cautiously optimistic about the new Resident Evil movie that's coming out in a few months. I like the director. Zach Kreger did a good job with Weapons, so see what he can do with that. So yeah, there's probably the main ones. I think the new Spider-Man movie will probably be good. I don't know if we needed 4 of them at this point, but I think it'll be fun. So there is that as well. But yeah, I think overall it's not been an amazing year for movies, unfortunately.
Well, that sounds good anyway to be getting on with. Well, thank you so much, Will Jordan. Thank you for joining us. Speak to you soon.
Thank you.